as is Tagore on the violence of nationalism towards a manifesto for Other-Regardingness and another cosmopolitanism. So, of course, I'm assuming that many people here would be fairly familiar with Tagore's very, very important work on nationalism, and I shall be speaking about it and referring to it towards the end of my presentation. But before that, I would also be touching upon two other concepts which are there in the title of my presentation, which is, of course, something which is also there in your concept note, which is about othering and other-regardingness. And of course, there's a long tradition of this relationship between the self and the other, and one can't really take on everything in this presentation, but I will certainly be touching upon some of that. And of course, I will also be talking about cosmopolitanism. But of course, as you can see, that I've qualified cosmopolitanism by referring to not cosmopolitanism as such, but another cosmopolitanism. This is, of course, a borrowing of a phrase, and that's why it's in quotes, from Sela bin Habib. And so I will also be referring to that. So if you'll give so is my screen visible, Nilanjan? I'm so sorry because I can't see. Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
yes, 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 yes. It's absolutely visible. Yeah.
Is it scrolling? I mean, when I scroll, does it scroll?
No,
It
no.
isn't scrolling. I mean, so is it scrolling now? No.
Yes, no, now it is good. Yes, yes, now
All
it is
right,
good. Yeah.
perfect, perfect. All right. So just in case if it is not moving, just alert me. Just message me in the chat box, and I will speak about. I mean, I will rectify that. So yeah. So like I said, that I will be talking about other-regardingness and another cosmopolitanism, and towards the end, I will be talking to you about a little bit about Tagore. I want to, of course, begin by talking about the fact that these are indeed troubled times, and I think whether we look around the world, whichever continent you think about, whether it's Africa, whether it's Europe, whether it is Asia, the US, wherever. I mean, America, you see that there are troubles brewing everywhere. And of course, we see that all around us, we see that sectarian identity assertions are raising their ugly heads. And we can see that in different parts of the world. I don't want to name those parts of the world, but all of us are aware that identity assertions largely drawn on sectarian lines are being are spawning everywhere. And often we see that they get also expressed through violence. And we can see that in Iran, we can see that in Ukraine, we can see that in Palestine. I mean, you can think about n number of places, but we can see that a lot of these sectarian identity assertions are also expressed through violence. And of course, what they are doing, therefore, is that they're also challenging the foundations of uh, what we've thought humanity to be or human life to be. And of course, we as those who are invested in humanities education obviously are concerned about some of these important aspects which define the objects of our engagement. And so, therefore, probably it is only timely that we should discuss the idea of another cosmopolitanism as a possibility to redress this issue of identitarianism, where we can possibly have the potential of embracing the other, which can be a gesture of embracing the other, because we've seen enough discourses which feed into the othering of the other. But can we think of discourses which can take us beyond I, me, myself, identity, politics, self-sameness, etc., to the world of the other and to embracing the other rather than vilifying the other or being at war with the other. And so, therefore, no, I'm interested in this particular concern, and I will also speak about this in relation to an instance of Indian literature, and which I've already indicated that I will be referring to Tagore on nationalism, where we can see that already in Tagore's views on nationalism, there was already a contrapuntal view which was offered as also, and which was contrapuntal to its own times, that is the idea of colonial modernity, but which is probably even as relevant today. We've been through a long history since Tagore, and of course, nations were important categories. They were fulcrums of anti-colonial movements. Um, and nation, of course, was a very, very important category till nation became a symbolic category under a certain idea of globalization, and nation itself was seen as a category which must be therefore critiqued. And we've seen a number of critiques from Benedict Anderson to Ed Skeller to to all kinds of people who've talked about nation and its fragments and all kinds of things. So therefore, I'm not going to go into that. But we are back to the idea of the nation, and the idea of the nation that we have before us, where nations are at war with each other. In the name of identity, in the name of sectarian identity politics today, probably it becomes urgent for us to look at what are the ways that we can think of stepping out of these folds and thinking of possibilities of embracing the other, and of course, some sort of a version of another kind of cosmopolitanism which can help us redress this issue. Of course, within our own discipline of English literature, and of course, I must add a rider here, which is that if you look at the if you look at our literature itself, English literature itself, and how itself it would have developed within post-colonial idiom in our own context in some senses. There are attempts, of course, made to use literature and culture as a springboard for doing identity politics. And we've seen that in relation to race, in relation to gender, in relation to religion, in relation to region. And so, therefore, there are all kinds of identity oriented literature and cultural studies, whether it's Dalit or Northeast or Kashmiri or whatever. I mean, there are all kinds of identity and identity based analysis of literature and culture which become important in our discipline itself. But what we would also know fairly well from our long engagement with the discipline of literary studies is that the mandate of studying literature and culture in general, and of course, particular in writing in particular, is actually to take us beyond ourselves, beyond the here and now, beyond ourselves into the world of the other. Which is another time, another place, another location, another people. And so, therefore, it is precisely to be able to defamiliarize ourselves from our own spaces, from our own times, from our own values, from our own concerns. And it makes this ethical gesture by virtue of writing, by virtue of being a literary piece, of taking us into another world, into another space or time. And this is largely what our engagement of literature is, even when we study, let's say, ancient literature, or whether we study literature from different parts of India, or whether we study, American literature, Australian or Fijian or African or Canadian or whichever kind of literature. Literature precisely dislocates us from our own position, from our own location, and takes us into another world, into another place, to another place, another time. And so, therefore, it brings us face to face with the other. And that's precisely what literature does. Literature does not give us only, as some people would think, only the cocoon of our own I, me, myself identity politics, but it also takes us beyond our identity into the world of the other. And that's also an important aspect of literature, or potential of literature, which we can't really undermine. And so, therefore, literature always holds the promise of a cosmopolitical democracy, because, and of course, I don't use the term cosmopolitan, I will explain that a little later, but it is supposed to be democratic in its spirit by taking us beyond ourselves to the world of the other. And of course, therefore, the key words which become important for me are, of course, cosmopolitanism on the one hand and writing on the other. And what I will show in my presentation is to look at the relationship between cosmopolitics on the one hand and writing on the other, since that's what we are concerned with, that how literature is cosmopolitical, how literature itself can lead to cosmopolitics, to lead us to the world of the other, or make us more other regarding in that sense. And then, of course, I will give you an illustration of the same through Tagore and Tagore's articulation of what he has to say about nationalism. And so let me simplify things and tell you what my argument is. So let me just short circuit my argument and tell you what I would be presenting in my talk. And so what I will go on to do is that I will begin by analyzing how Immanuel Kant, philosopher Immanuel Kant, that I'm sure all of you would be familiar with, he gave, of course, a formative definition of cosmopolitanism. And he had, of course, made hospitality as an important condition of cosmopolitanism. But for him, the idea of cosmopolitanism, where hospitality would be accorded to the alien or to the foreigner, it relied heavily on the agency of the nation, that the nation had the agency to be able to accord hospitality to the other. And we know that nation itself is a product of modernity. But what I will do, after touching a little bit about upon Kant, to primarily situate and locate the idea of cosmopolitanism, I will of course touch upon how he has been critiqued by Jacques Derrida. And those of you who are familiar with Jacques Derrida would know about his work, very, very important work on cosmopolitanism and forgiveness, where he displaces, the Kantian idea of the role which he gives to the nation as the fulcrum through which one can be hospitable to the other. And instead, what he goes on to say is that that the agency of hospitality, and of course with that of forgiveness, uh, uh, actually I mean, of course, he connects it to two categories. So not the nation, but instead to the city, which is that there are cities of refuge, which are non-national bases. So no longer the nation space, but primarily the idea of cities. That city is essentially of a refuge to aliens or to foreigners or to strangers, or whichever word one may want to use. And the second thing, of course, is that forgiveness is essentially, or the idea of embracing the other, or the idea of forgiveness, is primarily is a repetitive an iterative quasi-linguistic act, which is how it is performed. So it is between two singularities, that I forgive you, or if somebody asks for forgiveness and somebody gets asks to be forgiven and somebody forgives. And what he goes on to do is very interesting, which is that for this he draws inspiration not from modern nation or modern categories such as the nation, but instead he draws inspiration from pre-national formulations of both traditions, the Hebraic tradition, and I will talk a little bit about St. Paul, and also the Hellenic tradition. And so he draws inspiration from both the Greek and the we see the Hebraic tradition, and he pre-national and in pre-national, in pre-national formulations, he locates the idea of cosmopolitanism, which is pre-national, and so therefore not necessarily, as Kant would imagine, as nation as the agent in some senses. And so there and this and so I will talk a little bit about Derrida, and then of course I will take you through Salah Ben Habib, who I've already spoken about, who essentially goes on to talk about another kind of cosmopolitanism. So not the Kantian kind, not the Derridian kind, but another kind of cosmopolitanism, which of course on the one hand eschews and abrogates the idea of a sectarian idea of a nation, but it also does not really fall into some sort of an amorphous, vague, dilettante idea of cosmopolitanism, which is like, wishy-washy, etc. But instead, she posits the idea of the cosmopolitical, which is what I'm interested in. And so, therefore, this another kind of cosmopolitanism, which is what can possibly be a way of going beyond the current times that we're living through, and as a tool towards democracy to come, that I will see that the echoes of what I'm trying to say can be found actually in Tagore's prophetic critique of the nation in his famous 1917 work called Nationalism. And so therefore I would give an example of this idea of a manifesto for cosmopolitanism, another kind of cosmopolitanism from Indian literature itself. Um, so let me first go to Kant. So this is my argument. So I will talk about Kant. I will talk a little bit about Derrida's critique of Kant, and his critique of the idea of the nation, and instead talk about cities, and then of course already preempting the idea of language and literature, and which of course gets really taken up by Salah Ben Habib in her idea of another cosmopolitanism. And then of course I will come back to Tagore, and to show that how within Indian literature itself Tagore was also voicing this in 1917 itself. So of course, to come to Kant, our Contemporary attempts to understand cosmopolitanism, of course, takes us back to the root of this very, very famous essay of Kant, which was published in 1795, which is called Perpetual Peace. It's a short, kind of essay for those of you who might be interested in reading. It's a free PDF which is available, so you can read it. And in Perpetual Peace, this essay of his, 1795, Kant essentially presents this argument that with increasing trade, with increase in travel, with commercial relationships developing between nation states, soon war would have become a thing of the past, because the need for economic growth will require nations to be hospitable to each other, leading to a certain kind of mutual tolerance and cosmopolitanism. Now, this is the general idea that Kant has about the beginning of modernity, about modernity and about nations. And of course, what he goes on to say is that because of economic growth being at the heart of how nations are coming together, for trade and for travel and for commercial relationships, etc., etc., nations will be forced to be hospitable to each other, to tolerate each other, and to therefore become cosmopolitanism because of this economic rationale. And so, therefore, things like war would become a thing of the past, and wars would therefore come to an end. Now, this is, of course, a very interesting idea, but we know that while Kant was writing in the 18th century, 20th century already, when we are when we are at the other end of the debate, in some senses, we can see that we've faced numerous wars, across different nations, across the globe. But of course, the big wars, which are the world wars themselves. But this was his vision in 1795, and for him, therefore, his conception that nation states will have to cooperate precisely for economic growth. Um, he would make hospitality as a very important aspect of understanding cosmopolitanism, and he would say this about hospitality. So if you look at the screen and the code, he would say, so hospitality, of course, becomes key for him, and he would say, and I quote him, so if you look at the intended quote, he says, hospitality means the right of a stranger not to be treated as an enemy when he arrives in the land of another. One may refuse to receive him when this can be done without causing his destruction. But so long as he peacefully occupies his place, one may not treat him with hostility. It is not the right to be a permanent visitor that one may demand. A special contract of beneficence would be needed in order to give an outsider a right to become a fellow inhabitant for a certain length of time. It is only the right of temporary sojourn, a right to associate, which all men have. They have it by virtue of their common possession of the surface of the earth, where as a globe they cannot infinitely disperse, and hence must finally tolerate the presence of each other. Now, this is very interesting what Kant goes on to say. If you look at his idea of hospitality, where of course he's talking about the fact that it's not about giving rights of a permanent visitor, but it is only a temporary kind of an arrangement where we have to associate, and in any case there's a compulsion because there's only a common limited surface of the earth, and the globe is not expanding, and so therefore one cannot infinitely disperse. And because of this contained space that we belong to, we will have to finally tolerate each other. And this is what he, of course, goes on to say. Now, there are, of course, a few things which we must note here. First of all, of course, as we can see from what he has had to say, under his idea of the covenant of perpetual peace that the nation states would arrive at, the outsider that he's talking about, or the other, would indeed be tolerated, but and not meted out with hostility. But he would only be given a temporary visitation rights and no permanent resident rights. This already, of course, suggests certain limitations in Kant's definition of hospitality. It's not an open-ended hospitality. It is already a conditional hospitality in some senses, where the ideas of tolerating the other are premised on certain conditionalities in some senses. And of course, apart from the limitations which are there in the quote itself, Derrida, who I will move on to next, points out how on several other grounds also, Kant's idea of cosmopolitanism, which often we think of as the beginning of cosmopolitan thought, is actually, according to Derrida, a break in cosmopolitan thought or the existing chain of true cosmopolitics, because Kant makes hospitality conditional. He makes it conditional. He gives conditions for being hospitable to the other. And so, if you look at the next quote, which I will read before you, this is a quote from an interview which was given by Derrida to Geoffrey Bennington in 1997, wherein he points about the limitations, of course, of Kant's notion of hospitality and cosmopolitanism. It's a long quote, so I will read it for you. He says, and I quote him, there is a tradition of cosmopolitanism, and if we had time, we could study this tradition, which comes to us from, on the one hand, Greek thought with the Stoics, who have a concept of the citizen of the world. You also have Saint Paul in the Christian tradition, also a certain call for a citizen of the world as precisely a brother. Yes, St. Paul says that we are all brothers, that is, sons of gods. So we are not foreigners. We belong to the world as citizens of the world. And it is this tradition that we could follow up until Kant, for instance, in whose concept of cosmopolitanism we find the conditions for hospitality. But in the concept of the cosmopolitical in Kant, there are a number of conditions. First of all, you should, of course, welcome the stranger, the foreigner, to the extent that he is a citizen of another country, that you grant him the right to visit and not to stay. And there are a number of other conditions that I can't summarize here quickly. But this concept of the cosmopolitical, which is very novel, very worthy of respect, and I think cosmopolitanism is a very good thing, is a very limited concept. End quote. Now, as you could make out already in the small quote that I've read before you from Derrida, he's of course citing that we have before Kant, who we generally think of as the beginning of cosmopolitan thought, or with whom we usually associate the idea of cosmopolitanism, he of course points out that actually he does not really mark the beginning of cosmopolitan thought. There is a whole tradition of cosmopolitanism which exists within the Hellenic tradition and the Hebraic tradition, where we have for instance, the Greeks, the idea of the citizen of the world with the Stoics, and of course, in the Christian tradition, we have St. Paul, where one would think of the rest of the neighbors as brothers, and so therefore not really as foreigners. And so for him, actually, Kant marks the end of cosmopolitanism precisely because he makes cosmopolitanism a conditional category. The idea of the citizen of the world or the idea of the brother is not conditional on any premise within the pre-existing traditions in some senses. Now, if I go on beyond this, over and above, of course, the observation that I've already made on the basis of the quote that I had from Kant, that Kant only talks about temporary visitation rights. Derrida, of course, has raised other points about the limitations of Kant's idea of cosmopolitanism. And so Kant, of course, comes more as a break in the long tradition of hospitality rather than what Kant's idea of hospitality is, which is that modern states, nation states, will perforce arrive at the idea of perpetual peace among themselves because of economic reasons, and wars would disappear. And but we know that that's something which did not really happen. And of course, as Derrida demonstrate, that hospitality is a much older concept which comes from the Greek cynics and Stoic philosophers on the one hand, and of course within the biblical tradition or the Hebraic tradition from both the Abrahamic tradition and from St. Paul, the Pauline tradition, when we did not even have the concept of the nation state. And so cosmopolitanism is a much older concept than nation states themselves. And there is the idea of co-living, or living with the other, or living with the other as a brother, or living with other as a citizen of the world, which is pre-nation, and it's not really hinged on some conditions of economic, or some compulsion of economic growth and things like that. And so of course, so of course, for Derrida, and of course, as I'm also saying, that Kant's modern idea of hospitality and cosmopolitanism is of course conditional and limited, therefore. And of course, what Derrida also points out is that Kant's idea of hospitality seems to, of course, privilege the local community, which can dole out, almost as a gesture of beneficence or being kind to the foreigner or to the other, and of course, this local community often is is seen in conjunction with the nation and the nation state, and therefore the machinery of the nation state, which is the police and the repressive machinery in some senses. And so therefore the agency of the Kantian kind of hospitality actually lies with the machinery of the nation state, and it does not really belong to the individual, to the city, or to the people, which is what we will see, let's say, for example, in Derrida or in Salah Ben Habib. And so now I move on to to Derrida. When Derrida went on to publish his very important work in 2001, which is called On Cosmopolitanism and Forgiveness, though he adopts a number of views which come from Kant, his chief argument, of course, is that it's not the nation state, but actually cities, which historically have been the sites of of hospitality, of future-oriented hospitality. Cities have always given refuge. So he has this idea of cities of refuge, where most major cities of the world, from the Middle Ages onwards, and how they are currently, of course, demographically also constituted through the 1990s and 2000s to the present times, have often followed. Have often fallen outside the purview of the official nation state machineries, and have been cradles of cosmopolitanism and hospitality. So, of course, as opposed to the Kantian idea of the nation state, in Derrida we have the idea of cities of refuge. So, not the nation, but instead the city, which has been through Middle Ages down till the present times, have offered refuge to the outsider. And so we can see that in the demographics that we see of even modern cities in some senses, even the city that I am in, for instance, Delhi, who are the Delhi Walas? I mean, it is often, it is a city which gives refuge to all kinds of people who come from outside. And so therefore, he has this idea of cities of refuge and not really the nation as the fulcrum of hospitality. And this idea where the nation itself is problematized as the seat of cosmopolitanism gets further highlighted by Salah Ben Habib, who also I named a little while back, in a very important book called Another Cosmopolitanism, which was published in 2006, and where, of course, what she goes on to show is that Kant's idea of cosmopolitanism, of course, is state-sponsored, nation-state sponsored, and of course, the mechanism of its implementation primarily depends on the machinery of the nation state or the rulers of the nation state. So whether refuge will be given to the outsider or not largely rests with the state and the state machinery. And so if I share a quote by Ben Habib for you, she says, and I quote her: "Cosmopolitan citizens still needed their individual republics to be citizens at all. And end quote. And the onus of according refuge or asylum still lies with the sovereign." So, of course, what she goes on to say is that we might have the idea of cosmopolitan, we might have the idea of a cosmopolitan citizen, but ultimately that citizen has to belong to a nation, and it's precisely the nation and the sovereign of the nation who has the power to be able to accord refuge or asylum to the other in some senses. And in fact, Ben Habib also quotes Derrida that this idea of cosmopolitanism, where apparent hospitality is given to the other, a refuge is given or asylum is given to the other, it is essentially juridico-political. So, of course, it is political, and it is also legal. I mean, it is also invested in the juridico-political machinery in some senses. Where, and she quotes, she says, "Limits are set, boundaries are established and protected with violence. Asylees are turned away, refugees are denied entry and aid, citizens are denaturalized." So, of course, what she goes on to say is that this juridico-political vision of cosmopolitanism invested into the body of the nation state somehow works with this premise of limits, setting limits, creating boundaries, and of course. And of course, we've seen, ships being turned away, and people can be just left to the seas, where asylees are turned away, refugees are denied entry, they're not given aid. And so, in some senses, those who might have been citizens of another nation state are also denaturalized, through this idea of this juridico-political idea or political idea of hospitality. And so therefore what Ben Habib, Salah Ben Habib offers, taking some inspiration from Derrida, of course, is to say that different from this nation occasion idea of hospitality, or even a city based idea of hospitality, one has to look at new forms of political agency and subjectivity, which where she primarily relies a lot on Derrida's idea of writing or iteration, and which Ben Habib, of course, calls democratic iterations, which is that the iterations or the writings of the people themselves, democratics of the demos, of the people themselves. So, not the nation or the city, but of the individual, of the not individual in that sense, but I mean of the people, of the citizen, of the individual in that sense, and which, of course, for her are therefore linguistic or literary or cultural repetitions by the people themselves, which transform through their continuous invocation and revocation. They establish ideas of the limits, of the boundaries, of who's a refugee, of asylees, of who's the other. And so, therefore, what Ben Habib says is and for her, therefore, when people themselves engage with these linguistic, literary, cultural acts of these categories of hospitality, of forgiveness, of asylees, of citizens, etc., etc., then they can reappropriate and reinterpret the rules, and become not just the subjects but also the authors of the law. So people can become the authors of the law rather than simply being subjected by the laws which are decided by the sovereign, the nation state enforces, and they have to simply just follow and get subjected by it. And so, if you look at this quote by Ben Habib, she says, the democratic people can reconstitute itself through such acts of democratic iteration so as to enable the extension of democratic voice. Aliens can become residents, and residents can become citizens. Democracies require porous borders. And so, her idea of how democratic repetitions or articulations of literature, of culture, can actually extend the democratic voice such that aliens can no longer be aliens, they become residents, and residents themselves have the potential to become citizens. And so, therefore, her idea of a democracy to come is precisely the idea of porous borders, not closed borders, not walls, not the idea of turning away asylees and refugees, not providing aid, etc., etc. And so, therefore, her idea of a democratic iteration by people is precisely what will extend the democratic voice and will make the borders more porous. So, rather than the nation states being at war with each other, it's people to people contact or people themselves who can extend the democratic voice, according to Ben Habib. Um, and so and so this is her idea of the another kind of cosmopolitanism. So, of course, for Ben Habib, cosmopolitanism, her idea of cosmopolitanism, therefore, is the emergence of a new political configuration and new forms of agency inspired by interdependence. But it is an interdependence of people, not on the nation or the city in some senses. And so, therefore, uh, mm, Ben Habib, of course, following Derrida, elaborates that the idea of hospitality must not be only nation driven, but must be people driven. And of course, the repetitions which the people can make through these quasi or linguistic or literary or cultural acts precisely will extend the democratic voice and will therefore have the potential to be able to take us to a real cosmopolitics and not just some token cosmopolitanism or some qualified cosmopolitanism or some compromise cosmopolitanism, etc., which is oriented towards a democracy to come. And in fact, Derrida talks about two strategies through which this cosmopolitics would work. And that's what it's there in his book on, and that's there in the title of his work also, and the two sections of the book, which is called Hospitality and Forgiveness, and these categories that he deals with. Linguists, of course, would call these speech acts. And so, therefore, this literary linguistic idea of the cosmopolitical is already connected in some ways to speech and to writing and to literature and to culture. And in fact, in the second part of the book on cosmopolitanism and forgiveness, which is called On Forgiveness, um, mm, uh, he in fact elaborates, and Derrida in fact states this, that the nation or the public institution has neither the right nor the power to forgive, because the power uh, to forgive, and in fact what he also goes on to say is that what the nation can do, or a public institution can do at best, is through the political performance of a theater of forgiveness, a therapy of reconciliation. It can only do a theater, it can only make a spectacle out of forgiveness, but pure forgiveness engages only two singularities. So forgiveness is not between the nation or between an institution, but it is between two singularities, as far as Derrida is concerned, and which is, of course, as he goes on to say, between the victim and the perpetrator, and their discursive interaction in that sense. And so, therefore, for a true cosmopolitics to come, and which will take us beyond this whole idea of I, me, myself, and sameness, and sectarian identity politics, and the resultant violence and war that we've seen in the name of that, uh, rather than rely on some idea of vague or conditional cosmopolitanism, one needs to move beyond the idea of the nation and instead rely on cultural acts, democratic acts, of debating, of speech acts, of writing, and of literature and culture itself. And so, therefore, I will go on to Tagore straight away because I have very little time left. So, I will go on through Tagore fast, because I'm sure all of you are familiar with Tagore's famous collection of essays called Nationalism, where he shows that India has to eschew the idea of modern notions of nation and nationalism, and of course, he would, in this section called Nationalism in the West, he would say, neither the colorless vagueness of cosmopolitanism nor the fierce self-idolatry of nation worship is the goal of human history. So, of course, he would reject both the idea of vague idea of cosmopolitanism and the whole idea of nation worship itself. And so, therefore, Tagore distances himself from cosmopolitanism of this kind and parochialism. And in fact, we know Tagore's views about nation, and he says, and if you look at the quote, he says, nation, in the sense of the political and economic union of a people, is that aspect which a whole population assumes and organized for a mechanical purpose. When this organization of politics and commerce, whose other name is the nation, becomes all powerful at the cost of the harmony of the higher social life, then it is an evil day for humanity. And the nation, with all its paraphernalia of power and prosperity, its flags and pious hymns, its blasphemous prayers in the churches, and the literary mock thunders of its patriotic bragging, cannot hide the fact that the nation is the greatest evil for the nation. And of course, even in nationalism in India, he says nationalism is a great menace. It is the particular thing which for years has been the bottom of India's troubles. And one can go on about how nation is the worst kind of an aesthetic which has been invented. And of course, there's a systematic program of self-seeking and moral perversion, and so therefore we must be resentful of this category of the nation. And so, of course, there is this whole diatribe against the nation which he spells out. And of course, he was writing in the 1917s, but this is probably as true of today's time than it was at that point of time. We must know 1917 is also the beginning of the world wars in some senses, and look at where we are standing today. And what he, of course, goes on to say is that it's not about one particular nation, but about the abstract idea of the nation itself in terms of what nation does, that he has a problem with. And in fact, people who belong to the nation always try to project the idea of the nation, and they try to convert others also who may not live with the idea of the nation and convert them also into nations. And we've seen that nations, when it's people to people contact, it's a different story. But when nations fight, whether it's a cricket match or whether it's a real war, we can see what happens to the emotive, affective worlds that nation breeds in the people. And so, therefore, he's fairly dismissive of this idea of the sectarian, identity-oriented, parochial idea of the nation in that sense. And of course, he also therefore offers a direct critique of Kant's idea of perpetual peace, because there's no agreement between nations, and far from actually it leading to hospitality and peace, we've seen that it only nationalism in the West, it primarily went on to lead to world wars. And so, therefore, I'll leave this long quote here because I want to also leave some time for discussion. And so, therefore, rather than talking about nationalism and like sectarianism as its ideal, Tagore would talk about hospitality and tolerance of diversity and otherness as the prime goal that India should have. And so, if you look at this quote, and if you look at, I'll read this one quote. He says, "India is too vast in its area and too diverse in its races. It has many countries packed in one geographical receptacle. Be it said to the credit of India that this diversity was not her own creation. She has had to accept it as a fact from the beginning of her history. In America and Australia, Europe has simplified her problem by almost exterminating the original population. Even in the present age, the spirit of extermination is making itself manifest, and we can see that." He's writing in 1917, but it's true even of now. By inhospitably shutting out aliens through those who themselves were aliens in the land that they now occupy. But India tolerated difference of races from the first, and that spirit of toleration has acted all through her history. And so, therefore, what he goes on to say is that by virtue of the diversity which was presented to India in some senses, it has lived with diversity, and it's not the diversity or this idea of cosmopolitanism is something which comes with the idea of the nation state itself. And so, therefore, uh, uh, he would say that if you have to have the idea of a plural cosmopolitics of hospitality as opposed to the parochial idea of a political nationalism, India can offer this idea of another kind of cosmopolitanism as something which it can offer to the world. And in fact, if you look at the last quote, he says, "In spite of our great difficulty, however, India has done something. She has tried to make an adjustment of races to acknowledge the real differences between them where these exist, and yet seek for some basis of unity. In finding the solution of a problem, we shall have helped to solve the world problem as well. What India has been, the whole world is now. The whole world is becoming one country through scientific facility, and the moment is arriving when you also must find a basis of humanity which is not political." So, of course, he's telling us that it's not the political solution, but possibly a literary, cultural, creative solution that we have to come up with. And so, therefore, uh, I will, come towards the very end. If you look at what he has to say, nationalism in the West, and this is the last quote that I will read. He says, "The nation has striven long upon mutilated humanity. Men, the fairest creations of God, came out of the national manufactory in huge numbers as war-making and money-making puppets, ludicrously vain of their pitiful perfection and mechanism. Human society grew more and more into marionette show of politicians, soldiers, manufacturers, and bureaucrats, pulled by wire arrangements and wonderful efficiency." And so, of course, I must end this presentation, and how true this last quote of Tagore actually rings for today's time. We are seeing this everywhere, be it our own context, be it in Asia, be it in Middle East. We are seeing this everywhere. That the kind of intolerance and the kind of jingoism and the kind of violence which is being meted out in the name of nations and defending nations and nationalism, which is doled out, of course, in high decibels in media and establishment, and of course also in social media. They threaten the very foundation of who we Indians have inherited as a tradition, or even which is pre-modern in terms of the Hellenic and the idea of the Hebraic tradition, where we've had another cosmopolitan thinking as well, which is not really based on this whole idea of economic growth or or of war making, of money making, etc., etc. And so I will rest my case here by saying that if we have to be truly non-identitarian and if we have to have a true political pursuit of literature and culture, then we need to counter this whole idea of the modern notion of the nation state, and probably this is what this suspicion of this category is precisely what will be able to take us out of this sectarian identitarian politics which plagues our society today, and probably make us more responsive and more embracing of the other and of otherness itself, which is what the tradition has been for a fairly long time. So I will stop here, and I'm really sorry for having taken time till 3. But if there are any questions or comments, I'll be happy to respond to them.
Thank you, ma'am. I think you've got. Yeah. Um, ma'am? Yeah. Yeah, so I think we have a lot to say on that. Basically, I mean, it was a enthralling as ever. And ma'am, we have heard many of your lectures in the past as well. It was very intellectually stimulating. So I would start off the discussions. Maybe we can spend around 5 minutes on this, not more than that, maybe. In the meantime, I will also ask Debolina and Sharunuda to sort of frame their questions. So if to start off with, I think I was in attending a workshop done by Homi Bhabha the last week in the New School in New York. And there Professor Bhabha was talking about the fact that this whole idea of nationhood is very problematic because any presence on the border is always a problem. Whether you talk of the border in terms of the nation, border in terms of identity, border in terms of presence, any act of bordering itself is always a problem. And to top that, Professor Bhabha was talking about the fact that being a minority is not a problem. Minoritization is. The politics of minoritization itself is a big problem. And what we are seeing in Gaza, what we are seeing in Ukraine, what we are seeing in Kashmir is basically this whole politics of minoritization, not necessarily in terms of number, because in Kashmir the Hindus were killed, but the Hindus are a majority in India. Yet there was a minoritization of the Hindus in the Kashmir Valley, right? So that's precisely what Bhabha was talking about. Homi was talking about this whole politics of minoritization. So I was sort of wondering if you could sort of maybe put your comments on that.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I would tend to agree with his conception of that precisely the borders of the problem, and we've seen we've seen. I mean, and in our own context, I mean, we've seen Amitav Ghosh articulated so well in Shadow Lines. We've seen our own histories. One doesn't really need to go to the Holocaust or to look at what's happening in Palestine now, but I mean, even partition, for instance, in that sense. So, of course, you're absolutely right, which is that borders are precisely what the problems are, and whether these are borders which are hard borders in terms of nations, or whether these are borders across states, or whether it is borders in terms of who can who can come to the northeast, or who must whether a Bihari can come to Maharashtra. I mean, we've seen in our recent histories all these being articulated, and so who gets minoritized where, if one uses the metaphor that which you've used in that sense, that becomes of course a problem. So I think I would tend to agree with Homi Baba's idea, and this is exactly why what Salah Ben Habib says, which is the idea of another cosmopolitanism, where we can extend the idea of this, democracies require porous borders, that we have to create porosity, and porosity can be created precisely by these articulations through literature, through writing, through Amitav Ghosh, or through Homi Bhabha's articulations, etc. And so we have to continuously press against a certain kind of a certain kind of a creation of a discourse by precisely repeating the idea of the porosity of borders, rather than these hard borders and walls which are being built by forces. And I think I would completely agree with that, and that is exactly what was at the heart of my conception of another cosmopolitanism.
Exactly. Cosmopolitanism, at the heart of the very idea of cosmopolitanism is basically the idea of movement, isn't it? I mean, this freedom to move. I mean, whenever this freedom to move is curbed, that's where the nation comes in, and that's where the subjectivity of the sovereign comes in, isn't it? And that is where the problem is. Well, I would maybe ask Debolina to put a question if there is any. Debolina, are you there? I don't.
Hello.
Sharunuda, yeah. Debolina, yes.
Hello.
Put on your video as well. Yes.
Hello. Am I audible and visible? I'm sorry, there seems to
Yes.
be that. Oh, okay.
Yes, you're
So,
audible and visible both. Yes.
thank you for an illuminating lecture, ma'am. So, I have a question. So, the idea of nation and citizenship is changing constantly. So, do you think that today, now that we're in the age of AI, we are in the stage of intense technological surveillance, do you think that has some sort of profound impact on how the idea of citizenship is conceived, and how the idea of national borders or nationalism itself is conceived? Because we seem to be always under a state of surveillance. Like recently we had this arrest of this individual from Kolkata because she posted something along the lines of nationalism or anti-nationalism, however it may be viewed, ma'am. So that's my question, ma'am.
No, I'm so glad, Devulina, for that question. I mean, it's such an important question for us. I mean, you're absolutely right, which is that, I mean, and this has been theorized by many people, which is surveillance capitalism, but how surveillance capitalism precisely gets, and we've seen that. I mean, you can see it in popular culture, films like The Hack, Cambridge Analytica, which can persuade people to, and people can hire companies to win elections. And so, the sovereignty of the nation state is so much in the hands of surveillance capitalism or capitalism per se. And that's why, I think in some senses, Trump really represents that force for us, because it's not, that there is the political face and there is the, there's a corporate lobby, I mean, it's like the coming together of both in some senses. And therefore, it shocks us even more because, we're so far used to the idea of, there being the nation state, which has got a certain reformist face, etc., which is supposed to be pro people and not really serving the interests of the capital. But here we see an explicitation of that, that kind of coming together in this form. And so it kind of, opens up, what we've always known about nation and corporates working together in some senses. And so it's really not a surprise that surveillance capitalism is something which will feed, and which will actually dictate the futures of nations in some senses, and, will get used by nation states precisely to be able to, throw people into jail who are not convenient for them, or their versions of nation and nationalism. So it's not really a surprise. So I mean, so it's not really with AI. I mean, with it's precisely what has been an old crony of capital corporate nexus of nations, which have always been how nations have been, through the modern. Through the modern era, in some senses, which probably has got explicitated for us in terms of these examples that we have, which are not really scandals, but which are really which is precisely how surveillance capitalism feeds into the nation, and the nation and the surveillance capitalism works together in some senses. And so, the idea of population control, which Moho or Foucault would have talked about at a certain point of time, that's become much more easier with technology, where surveillance is so much easy with prompts and search tools and things like that. And we are and we are therefore subjected as citizens, though apparently in this very free social media world of digital whatever, etc., but none of that, of course, is without its surveillance, corporate capital, which is constantly either monetizing or us as data, or using this data precisely for and plugging it into the nation states and the interests of nation states or the corporate lobbies. So I mean, this nexus probably has got revealed more for us than it was before. So yeah, I'm so glad that you pointed that out, and I think you're absolutely right, which is that there is I mean, it's not really our friend. I mean, it's really the enemy, and we have to deal with that enemy in the way in which we have to.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
also,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
just a little, I wanted to add something. So, one thing I've noticed with this digitization is that a lot of misinformation is being fed. Like, even 15 or 20 years ago, we wouldn't have been exposed to this amount of misinformation,
Mm.
including deep fakes and all of that. So, I think what is a challenge for the coming generation is to separate the truth from all of the information overload that they are being bombarded with.
Absolutely. I mean, if you talk about platform capitalism or data capitalism and things like that, I mean, precisely. I mean, I mean, it is in its interest precisely to peddle fake, and to falsities, etc., precisely to confuse. I mean, you create such an amorphous. I mean, and then it's so easy to govern, isn't it? I mean, and so, and we've seen that. I mean, and these are. I mean, I also find that I mean, of course, we use the term of fake and whatever, etc., but they work fairly truly, in the sense that all of this fake media works fairly truly in terms of precisely being able to produce the effects that it is supposed to produce in the polity, precisely to be able to engineer elections, to be able to move emotions for in the interest of certain, figures or whatever, etc. So of course, a lot of the data which gets, moved, through the channels in which we see this data moving is precisely moving because of certain interest groups, which precisely, and so we call it, of course, fake. And it's not really about the other generation. I think it's about us and anybody who's part of these nodes that we are connected with. It is increasingly becoming difficult. I mean, you can have the most with deep fake, or with all kinds of AI generated voice, etc., people cheating you out of your money by making your son call you up and say. So I mean, it's not just about another generation, it's about all of us. I mean, I I think all of us, one way or the other, think that we won't fall for the scam, but you can very well fall for the scam. So it's not that anybody is outside the purview of the scam. When the scamsters are there to get everybody, I suppose. So, yeah.
Yeah. So since we are very short of time, Sharunada, if you can just, would you like to ask a question very briefly?
Just a brief question, ma'am. First of all, it was a wonderfully engaging lecture. We were all very enriched by your vision that you put forward in your paper. Ma'am, the very fact that Nilanjan pointed out that this entire question of alienating the foreign, being wary of the foreign other, has its root in the mobility itself. And if we look back, this mobility, it got its push, the big push through the Industrial Revolution, if we may say that. And it was so very welcoming for the world leaders back then, the European leaders, to welcome the skilled and talented pool of people from across the countries, across the continent. But now, these people, they were doing that in the 19th century for the sake of the industrial betterment, of course. But now, when we see that the industrialists, the capitalists, they are now in one way or the other, kind of controlling the entire affairs of our nations across the spectrum of world politics. Why are they so wary of halting this mobility, of this pure arrivant, as Derrida calls it in his aporias, that who is never an invader nor a colonizer, who is just here as an integer, as an individual in a foreign land? Why are they so wary? These technocratic masters, why are they so wary? Are they wary because they just want data mired individuals and not individuals proper? Your thoughts on this, Mark?
No, I'm so glad that you asked this question, Sharana, and such an important question, in the sense that, of course, the nature of capital itself has undergone a change. At a certain point of time, labor had to move, but now labor does not really need to move. You can outsource labor in some senses. So mobility, of course, is also linked to how the nature of capital itself has undergone changes in some senses. But you're absolutely right, which is that, today in the age of where, we must not have this false illusion of ourselves even the idea of the subject and the subjectivity is modern idea. I think in the age of data capitalism, where we are ultimately rendered only into a data, we may or may not like the concept, but ultimately we get mined as data. Whether it's to sell products, whether it's to sell the algorithm in our phones, whether it is what kind of feeds will come or what reels you will watch, etc., etc. You're ultimately only a data in some senses. So we have this idea of the individual or the idea of the subject or whatever, etc., etc. But ultimately, the nature of capital itself has undergone such a change that that mobility is not really something which is really is not really crucial or critical in that sense, because what has moved is not really labor. In the sense, and that is an older process. We know outsourcing is not here and now, but now people, this whole idea of work from home, they don't even need to go to offices anymore. No, in the sense that our mobility can be, the each space can be your office or your phone can be your office. So the in some ways, what you say is true, and that is why probably I find the idea of what Salah bin Habib says, and what the idea that I was saying, which is that that while there might be forces which would not want us to move, and want us to only read, as a Bengali, I should only read Bangla literature, or as as a Dalit, only I can speak about a Dalit, or as a trans person, only I can, and not build any kind of solidarities, affinities, etc., with the other, and this identity-based politics, which we also have embraced within our own post-colonial, kind of idiom of responses. But I think the fundamental idea of literature or culture is precisely to be able to unhinge us, to take us beyond ourselves into another world, to another place, to another time, whether it's, it doesn't really matter whether it's Britain or whether it is, whichever place or time or whatever. And so this dislocation which literature and culture performs, and that's why I find the idea of these democratic iterations by people, these democratic repetitions by people, which can probably extend the idea of democracy policies rather than us becoming, caught in our own echo chambers, which will not really get us very far. So, I mean, even in the name of post-colonialism, what we do in India is just, writing in English or Indian literature and translation. How much we know about Fijian literature, or, so I mean, we've created our own, kind of versions of problems for ourselves.
Yeah,
Thank you,
it's
ma'am.
all about the politics of controlling, isn't it? And that's what my dear friend Falguni has pointed out right now. It's all about the politics of controlling and the whole architectonics of controlling that actually produces this whole idea of nation. I'm really afraid that we're so short of time. We have to go to the paper presentations now. But thank you so much, ma'am. I mean, it was so much of an honor to welcome you, and it was such an enthralling lecture. Thank you very much, and I hope that we will collaborate again in the future, and we will again hear you in the future as well. Thank you
Thanks.
very much.
Thank you to
And
everybody.
as far as the